Good morning, and thank you for attending our most recent webinar. Today, we're just going to do a bit of a general updated guidance for the workplace, as there's been a lot going on over the past month or so. I'm joined today by Louise Plant, who's our health and safety specialist and insurance, and of course I'm Vanessa Bell and head up the employment team at Pretties. I hope you're all well, and I would just like to remind you that the webinar is live. So if you have any questions as we go along the webinar, then please do type them and we will deal with them, most probably at the end, because a few of the topics that we're going to be discussing today very much overlap with the employment aspects and the health and safety aspects. But we will deal with all the questions that we receive. And also, before I forget, because I always sometimes forget at the end of the webinar, when you log out of it, a very brief survey page comes up, and we'd be really grateful if you are able to just give us your feedback on the webinar. Thank you. So today, Lou is going to give us a health and safety update. She's going to give us a really useful return to the workplace update, a look at the current guidance, including pointing out what has changed. I'm going to talk about the need to be Covert Secure. We're going to talk about high-risk employees, particularly those whose shielding has ended at the end of March. We're going to also, both of us actually are going to talk about face coverings, so from the health and safety aspects, and also from me, from the employment aspect. And we're also going to talk about a really hot topic, which is vaccination rollout. I will then pick up on the employment considerations of vaccination rollout, as well as lateral flow tests, as I know a few of you have already kind of got some burning questions in relation to lateral flow tests. And I will just provide a little bit of a general update of trends that I'm seeing in the employment sphere and issues that employers are facing. We are also going to do a little bit of a survey towards the end of the webinar, and I'd be really grateful if you could participate in that. I'm going to keep you all in suspense as to the topic of the survey, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So first of all, I'm going to pass over to Lou, who will cover the health and safety aspects of the webinar. Thanks, Lou.
Thanks, Vanessa. So where are we now in terms of the current guidance and in terms of the roadmap? You may recall in the past that the government, when it comes to the guidance that they issue for all different industries, has been updating that guidance as we go along over the last year. And the wording of that guidance has changed. The issues that need to be considered has changed, again, industry specific. And they've now, in light of the roadmap that was announced in the spring, they've now updated the guidance, in particular with regards to the return to the workplace and in terms of offices and contact centres in particular. So what is the current guidance now? Well, in terms of the roadmap, offices and contact centres can remain open, provided they're Covert Secure. And I'll go on and just do a brief reminder shortly with regards to what Covert Secure means. So what's the wording now in terms of whether you want your employees at home or in the workplace? Now, you may recall over the last year, we've had all manner of different wordings. Employers have been asked to do different things and consider different issues at different stages in the lockdown. So when we were confined back to our houses last March, it was to work from home. That guidance was then released in August to give employers more scope, and then it changed again in September. And then in January, when we went into this lockdown again, the wording changed. So at that point, it was unless it's impossible to do your job from home, that's where you should be. Now, in terms of the roadmap, the wording has changed again, and the wording is on the slide now. Office workers should continue to work from home where they can. And again, I think in terms of that, in terms of what employers should be thinking about, I think we're back to the August, September time, where employers have got quite a bit more scope with regards to considering what's best for their workplace and what's best for their workers. And I'll go on to explain that in a bit more slightly. In terms of that guidance at the moment, the suggestion is that that wording will remain until step 4 of the roadmap, which is at the end in 21st of June, when they're going to do a review of everything, including social distancing measures. So that's the wording that we're going to use, and that's the wording that we need to consider at the moment from an employer's perspective with regards to where your employees are. So what does that mean? What do employers need to be thinking about? Now, the last year has thrown up a variety of issues in terms of home working. Some people have taken to it well, productivities remain constant. Other people have struggled for various reasons, for personal circumstances. They might find working at home physically challenging because of where they actually live, if they live in a flat share. Some people have found it a struggle because of the mental health issues that it's thrown up, feelings of isolation, which has caused anxiety and stress, and that's impacted upon productivity. And that's been a big issue over the last year. Certainly, I have to say, I myself, I'm fed up of working from home, and the last few weeks, I just want to get back into the office, to be honest. I'm done with it. And different employers have had to take into account different situations and different personal circumstances of those individual employees. Now, it's the first time that guidance has now reflected that and reflected the hardship that working from home has caused for many. I mean, some people have taken to it absolutely fine and it's completely revolutionized their life, but a lot of us have struggled. And now in the guidance that's been flagged up. And it says employers should now consider whether home working is appropriate for workers facing mental or physical difficulties or those with a particularly challenging home working environment. And that's the first time really they've put that into the guidance, which certainly gives employers a lot more scope. I mean, in a way, it makes it slightly more difficult, I guess, because employers should be taking into account each individual's needs and their own personal circumstances to decide what's best for them. But it's nice that it's been finally flagged up and certainly seems to kind of give the green light to employers to take into account. It's not as straightforward. You either work from the office or work from home. It's not straightforward. It is individual, industry, role based, and you need to make a decision in conjunction with your employees based upon their needs. The other thing that's been flagged up in the guidance this time is because at the moment, the roadmap still suggests that we're to minimise travel, and in particular, use of public transport to prevent big crowds of people mixing. So that's something else that employers have been asked to consider when deciding where their employees should work. So if you've got an employee that needs to use public transport to get in, the suggestion is perhaps you have a think about changing their working practices, their working times to allow them to avoid busy periods to try and reduce the impact of huge numbers of people using public transport at the same time. But certainly from my perspective, it's nice to see that we kind of seem to be back where we were last August, September. Employers have got the scope now to consider what's best for their employees and what's best for their workplace. Certainly the guidance now, it basically encourages a mix of home and office-based working where full home working is not possible. But as I said, I think the key from an employer's perspective, engage with their employees, what's their circumstances, what works best for them. If it is working from home, then you need to make sure that there are good lines of communication in place. You need to make sure that those employees have all the equipment that they need to get on with their job, because the benefit is that everybody is happy in their work, which means that they can do their job well, and we can also hopefully get on with things a bit better. So that's what the current guidance is. The suggestion is that won't change. If anything, I'm hoping after maybe June, that'll open up a bit more, but we'll see what happens. So what else has changed? The other things that have been inserted into the guidance is the option of lateral flow testing. And I'm sure you'll probably all be aware that the government have now opened it up to the public and requested that or advised that we all go and be tested twice a week. Lateral flow testing, it's regular testing for asymptomatic staff who cannot work from home. This is different to the PCR tests that are undertaken if you are symptomatic of COVID. The idea is that you pick up asymptomatic or you pick up someone who may have the virus and then you can isolate them and hopefully reduce the transmission of the virus. That's the plan. Both me and Vanessa are going to touch on this from an employer's perspective in terms of whether or not you want to consider this for your workplace. There were free test kits available until the end of June, but you needed to register your interest as a business by the 12th of April, and that deadline has passed now. So if it's something that you want to consider for your workforce, you can still get access through private providers, which will charge you, or as you're probably aware, across the UK, a number of community testing sites have been set up. So the big issue for employers from this perspective is whether or not you want to request that your employees undergo lateral flow testing as a matter of course. I think my advice from the health and safety perspective is going to be similar to what I'm going to give in terms of the vaccination, and that it's going to be a case-by-case basis. It's going to be dependent upon your industry, your workers, and their roles and their responsibilities. A big factor will be whether or not your staff are public facing, in which case you might think that the encouragement of lateral flow testing or the requirement of lateral flow testing is higher up on your agenda because you are public facing. And therefore you think that that's a proportionate response to the situation to try and keep your staff safe and to try and keep the public safe. You may, if you're, for example, working in retail, it might be something that you want to consider. I'm mainly working from home, in which case my risk to myself and to others is relatively low. So pretties in all likelihood won't be requesting that we do lateral flow testing because it's not proportionate. I should flag up with regards to the testing itself, there are a number of practical concerns that you want to think about if it is something that you want to consider. Someone needs to be qualified or certainly have experience to be able to take the tests. You also need to store that information. So you need to think about GDPR in terms of storing that medical information, how it's administered practically. And you might decide that if your workplace is COVID secure, that actually you don't need lateral flow testing. It's not something, because of the nature of your work, because perhaps you aren't coming into contact so much with the public, that it isn't something that you need. You've done everything else that you can. That response is reasonable. To request that people undertake lateral flow testing in light of your workplace may be a disproportionate, overly administratively burdensome practice, and that actually it's just not appropriate for you. It is a matter for you, dependent upon your workforce and what they do. The other things that have changed in terms of the guidance, there's much more an emphasis on ventilation in the workplace now to reduce aerosol transmission. And so it's encouraging, if you have air conditioning units or fans or, just keeping windows open, it's just the encouragement of ventilation more. That's more emphasized in this revision of the guidance that's now out. And they've also added the roadmap dates to the guidance as well. So that's what's changed. Mainly, there's flagged up the issue of whether employers want to consider lateral flow testing over and above what the government are asking the public to do in any event, emphasis on ventilation and the addition of the roadmap dates. And the main point from getting people back into the work is the changing to the working with regards to where people should be working. So just a quick reminder, what does COVID Secure mean and what does it involve? I've been over this quite a few times now. I'm sure you're probably all familiar with it. Just a recap, but it's worth continually, in light of the guidance changing, review your COVID-19 risk assessment, consider what adjustments need to be made to your workplace. And again, those adjustments will be very much dependent upon your workplace, your workforce, the layout of your workplace, what's available to you, what resources do you have to put into this. Becoming COVID secure is no mean feat, and you need to be looking at what's available to you, what can you do with what you've got, basically. And that will be very much individually dependent upon your business. The aim with regards to becoming COVID secure is to remain social distancing. That's the key. If you can keep 2 meters apart, if you can put in place a workflow, if you can adapt your working layout, the workstations, the way that you walk around the office so it's a one-way system, if you can put in place those systems so that people can remain 2 meters apart, that's the aim. If you can't keep your workforce 2 meters apart, then you need to think about risk mitigation, which means arranging the way that they perhaps sit so that they are back to back, they're not face to face, there's screens, putting in place hand sanitizers, or certainly taking other steps. So where you can't keep 2 meters apart, just doing other things that can reduce the risks. The advice certainly is also, again, no face-to-face meetings, and And it's also just to educate your staff in terms of their hygiene practices. The other thing that's flagged up in the guidance is to clean more often the workplace. Again, increased frequency of hand washing, surface cleaning, that's flagged up again even more so. Also, the NHS test and trace, you are encouraged to keep a record of all staff and contractors for a period of 21 days. So if someone is notified that they've picked up the virus, that you can easily see who that person may have come into contact with and take steps to encourage them to self-isolate as a result. And to encourage workers who don't feel well to stay at home. And that's to some extent, one of the key things at the moment is to try and sort of reduce the transmission. Again, it's based upon what's reasonably practicable for your business. And the key throughout all of this, and the key message throughout the whole of the last year, has been to engage with your staff. We're all in different situations. Our personal circumstances are different. Some of us are lucky enough to be fully healthy, no underlying conditions. Therefore, we aren't particularly anxious about returning to the office. Other people are either vulnerable themselves, or they have someone that's vulnerable at home living with them, and they may be more anxious about getting into the workplace. The whole point about sharing and engaging with your staff and finding out the personal circumstances of your staff is to try and get them to feel happy wherever they are in terms of their work. That's the idea. And the more you engage with them, the more you speak to them and you say, okay, this is what we're planning on doing to make it COVID secure, the happier that they're going to feel in terms of coming back to the workplace or working wherever that may be. And also you have to remember that in terms of any practices and procedures that you put in place, it's your workforce are the ones that are going to be able to say, well, that works, and actually that's becoming a real pain for me. That's restricting my working practices. Make sure that communication carries on so you can adjust your working practices. Again, the idea is to reduce the transmission of the virus, to do what's reasonable in your circumstances, and to ensure that your staff are happy coming back to the workplace, so they're productive, they're able to get on with their jobs. So high-risk employees, what are we doing in terms of them at the moment? As Vanessa mentioned, so shielding came to an end on the 31st of March. And I'm sure you're aware, high-risk employees there's a long list of people that are either deemed to be clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable. Those people are either over a certain age, they have diabetes, they may be undergoing treatment for cancer, they've had organ donations or replacements in the past. There's a whole list of factors that might make someone a high-risk employee. The advice was previously to keep them at home pretty much at all costs, unless it was impossible for them to do their job from home, unless you couldn't furlough them, unless there wasn't an alternative role, then they should be kept at home. We're past that point now. So the guidance has now changed. High-risk employees are still advised to work from home where possible, but they can attend the workplace if they can't work from home. Again, I think at this moment in time, it is about engaging with them. What are they happy to do? Can they do an alternative role? Can they change their working pattern, again, to avoid traveling during busy periods? What can they do if they can't work from home? Are they happy to come into the office? Engage with your staff, have a chat with them, see what you can do. If they cannot work from home and they are to come into the office and they're happy to come into the office, do you need to think about alternative steps for them in particular? Do you need to do a risk assessment? And I would advise doing an individual risk assessment for those employees, just so that you've got a record of a discussion between you as to what you've done, what steps you've taken to enable them to get on with their job, whether that's at home or whether that's back in the workplace. So I'm going to touch upon face coverings. They aren't mandatory in offices, but they are required for customers and staff in some businesses that are customer facing. So where you've got areas that are open to the public, retail, post offices, banks, estate agents, if you are working in those industries, then they are mandatory. Working in an office in general, they aren't. And actually the guidance suggests that it's kind of a last resort, in that you should be looking to maintain your 2 meters social distancing or 1 meters with mitigating steps. Face coverings are advised to be kind of, to some extent, a last resort. Now, from a health and safety perspective, the question that I'd be asking, is it reasonable to, if you're thinking of mandating that in an office, is it reasonable? And that will be very much dependent upon what you've done to make the office COVID secure. If you are able to keep 2 meters distance, if you've got hand sanitizers in place, if you're able to lay out the workplace so that there's a lot of space between people, there's a one-way system, it may well be deemed to be unreasonable for you to say, we want you to wear a face covering in the office. That's not to say that if staff want to, they're more than welcome to, but I wouldn't be mandating it unless you have exhausted all the other options that are available to you. And that is certainly what the guidance suggests. It's the last resort if all else fails. If you have visitors coming into the office where they've been exposed to the public, then that's a different situation and you're required to do so by law. But in the workplace itself, it's not mandatory unless you are public facing. So next on to perhaps the biggie question at the moment, and some of you may well have joined our previous webinar with regards to the no jab, no job. So where do we stand from the law, and what's the health and safety position? Well, the current law precludes forced vaccination. The Public Health Act 1984, the European Convention of Human Rights, prevents forced vaccination. It prevents forced medical treatment, whether that's psychological or physical, and that includes vaccination. So the law is that you cannot physically force someone to undergo vaccination. It is a personal choice, and that's the position as we stand. So the different issue, though, however, is whether or not, as an employer, you want to make it mandatory as a term of your employment. At the moment, whether or not that would be a reasonable instruction to your employees is going to be industry dependent. And I'm sure some of you know there is a consultation headed by Michael Gove at the moment that is taking place with regards to whether or not it should be mandatory for those that work in care homes to request that their employees have the vaccination. That remains to be seen at the moment. I can see that it might be reasonable in those situations because where you have a workforce that either are more susceptible to contracting the virus, or they are more susceptible to passing it on to someone who is clinically extremely vulnerable and therefore at a higher risk of becoming seriously ill, it may well be reasonable for you to request that. But we are still in the very early stages of the rollout. I'm 42. I've not been asked for my first vaccination yet. And I'm aware that we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. There will be a number of people in their 20s, 30s who haven't even been offered the first jab and may not be for some time. We don't know how long it's going to take for everyone to have the second jab. We also don't know, although the signs are good, how long immunity lasts and how efficient, what the efficacy is in terms of preventing transmission. There is still a whole host of unknowns at the moment, let alone the practical difficulties in you administering and thinking about how you're going to gather that information from your employees, in particular if we have to have boosters. It is an unknown at the moment. It's telling that the NHS haven't at this stage requested that their employees that make it mandatory. I wouldn't be rushing to have a vaccination policy at this stage. I would certainly be advising to keep it on your radar, keep up to date with the guidance, and where necessary, encourage your employees to have the vaccination in line with the government guidance and inform them of the benefits if you think that you need to. It will be very workplace, industry, role specific. It is not a cut and dried issue. And Vanessa is going to touch on perhaps the discrimination issues that might arise. I would again encourage you to have an open dialogue with your employees to make sure that everyone's happy. Keep that going and just see how we get on. But at the moment, I don't know whether it's reasonable or not to be requesting it. I think that remains to be seen. And I would be wary about going down that route at this particular stage when there's still so many unknowns. But I'll pass on to Vanessa and then we'll deal with the questions at the end, if that's okay.
Thanks, Lou. So moving straight on to the employment considerations with regards to vaccinations, because I think it's quite useful to have it kind of back to back. So you've got the health and safety and then the employment. Our last webinar, no, it wasn't our last webinar. Our last webinar was an IR35 and that thrilling topic. But the one before that was Lou and Matthew talking about just purely COVID-19 vaccinations. And actually, if some of you are really interested in that topic and want more kind of further detailed advice, then I would say that our advice kind of remains the same. And so if you do want to obtain a recording of that webinar, then do email us and we can send it over to you. But the other interesting thing is the day that we held that webinar, ACAS decided to update their guidance. And so ACAS guidance now has a page dedicated to what they call getting the coronavirus vaccine for work. And this includes a section on how to support staff to get the vaccine. And so mainly it's about supporting staff, encouraging staff to get the vaccine. So it talks about potentially suggesting employers can offer paid time off work to enable staff to attend vaccination appointments. And it also suggests that staff should receive full pay rather than SSP if an employee subsequently is off sick because of vaccine side effects. And as I say, no doubt they're recommending this because, of course, the government is very much encouraging those that are eligible in terms of the time frame of the rollout. That the government wants to encourage people to get the vaccine, and of course they wouldn't want employees or people worrying about losing pay as a potential barrier to getting the vaccine. And it advises that in most circumstances, it's best for employers to support staff to get the vaccine without making it a requirement. However, it goes on to say that if an employer feels it is important for staff to be vaccinated, then they should consult with staff. And where further steps are necessary, then these should be recorded in writing, and i.e. what they're saying is they suggest a vaccination policy should be in place, which obviously Lou's already covered. Interestingly, several points that were previously contained in the guidance prior to the 26th of February around vaccination have now been removed. So it no longer states that employers can't force staff to be vaccinated. And it also no longer states that employers should only make getting vaccines mandatory if it's necessary for them to do their job. I wouldn't really read too much into that, apart from to say that they recognise, along with everybody else, I think, that this is such a tricky issue. And it's going to take some time to develop and to evolve. Moving on, so that's kind of the ACAS guidance, which I hope is helpful for you. And it's always a good starting point to see what ACAS says, although, of course, it's not legally binding. It is just recommendations, but it is useful nevertheless. So in relation to employment considerations, if, let's get to the crux of it, can an employer make vaccinations compulsory from an employment law perspective? Well, not to kind of put the onus back on Lou, but really the health and safety considerations are highly relevant when looking at the employment aspect of it. Can overlap here. But essentially the additional employment considerations you need to think about is discrimination first and foremost, really. In terms of direct discrimination, a minimal risk here, because remember that for direct discrimination, you need to treat somebody less favourably because of their protected characteristic. And so I think it would be quite hard for somebody to fit a vaccination requirement into a direct discrimination box. Indirect discrimination is far more possible. And so essentially, if we look at the test of indirect discrimination, we think, okay, well, the vaccination requirement, if you were to introduce it, a vaccination requirement is like a policy that you'd be applying to all employees. And then those with a particular characteristic, whether it's, for example, their age, religion or belief, disability, maternity, are they potentially then disproportionately adversely affected by the requirement for vaccinations because of their protected characteristic? And can a discriminatory requirement be justified as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim? So that's essentially the test. So the first question is, well, are any groups put at a particular disadvantage? At the moment, you could argue age, because of course the vaccine rollout has been very much in terms of, those who are, it has been like age downwards, isn't it? As well as those with underlying health conditions that kind of put them higher up on the list. But, the 20 to 30s, 30 to 40s, we're looking at least a month or 2 or 3 before they can be vaccinated. So we have age as a consideration at the moment. We've got the potential protected characteristic of religious belief, either because of either against the vaccine itself or because of the contents of the vaccine. Disability is also another one to look out for, because some vaccines in production aren't suitable for certain individuals with suppressed immune systems or potential allergies as well. And pregnancy and maternity is an important one to remember as well, because the advice is that pregnant women shouldn't be vaccinated. And also some women may want to delay being vaccinated if they're trying to conceive. So that's another protected characteristic to think about. Another one is race, because there is hesitancy among some ethnic groups. So therefore, if we say a particular group is disadvantaged, we then have to look at, you as an employer, do you have a justification? What is your potential legitimate aim? Well, we go right back to Lou and we think about the health and safety of the workforce, potential legitimate aim. Protection of the public for those employers where staff have public-facing roles. A classic example, and one that was on BBC this morning, is care homes where staff come into contact regularly and close contact with vulnerable individuals. And also there's a potential legitimate aim of reducing the prevalence of the virus. So then we think about, okay, we've got a legitimate aim, but is it proportionate? The efficacy of the vaccine in preventing illness and transmission, it's we're getting more data, but it's certainly not clear-cut at the moment. We don't know how long the effects of the vaccine will last. And you kind of look at the available evidence from administered vaccines, but we're only really starting to properly apply the second doses. So essentially, it's too early to tell. And really, compliance with Covert Secure guidelines and introducing regular testing could be more effective and a less discriminatory means of achieving a health and safety legitimate aim than compulsory vaccinations. And the other point I just wanted to make was in terms of recruitment and potential discrimination. So I can envisage a situation, perhaps, say, I don't know, post-July maybe, where employers want to start asking employees, have you had the vaccine? Now, you have to be quite careful there, because asking a candidate about their vaccination status could actually be a prohibited health question under the Equality Act. So you may be aware that in recruitment processes, you shouldn't be asking employees before you've offered them a job whether they have any health conditions. And so obviously asking about vaccination status is linked to health. And so you shouldn't be asking those questions until a job offer has actually been made, unless the only exemption is if the question relates to a function that is intrinsic to the job, which I think would be quite limited. So that's just a point there in terms of recruitment. So moving on to unfair dismissal. So obviously, if you're looking to dismiss an employee, you need a potentially fair reason. And the applicable ones here would be misconduct, which could be refusing to be vaccinated or lying about vaccination status. Another potentially fair reason could be some other substantial reason, which would be the desire to keep the workplace safe. But not only do you need a potentially fair reason, you also need to show that the decision you took was reasonable. And this goes back to the points that Louise has been raising in terms of health and safety considerations. Is it really reasonable, when considering the other steps that can be taken in a workplace to mitigate risk, to compel your staff to take the vaccine or be dismissed? And so when looking at reasonableness, you'll think about, well, have you consulted with the staff? Have you considered all the alternatives? And it's a balance of interest between, health and safety and the employer's interests and, of course, the employees. So the practical guidance at the moment, what I'm going to say is I think probably repeat what Lou said, is that, encourage your staff to have vaccines in line with government guidance and inform them of the benefits, of course, do. I think it's too early to make vaccines mandatory, given the reasons that we've discussed. If you do, then you should certainly have a vaccine policy in place. And really it is about, open, clear and sensitive dialogue with your staff, and engaging with your staff around this topic. So moving from vaccinations to lateral flow tests. So again, we had that updated guidance that I mentioned on the 26th of February also covered lateral flow tests. And employers have been encouraged by the government to test their staff. So ACAS has got a new section which sets out what would be good practice for employers to discuss with staff when agreeing to implement workplace testing. It states that there is no law that says staff must be tested for COVID-19. And of course, although that was on the 26th of February, that's still the case now. And it also, the ACAS guidance says in most cases it won't be necessary. However, it recognises that some employers may want to bring testing in as part of workplace policy. If you're looking to do it, the ACAS recommends that you discuss and you consult with your staff. And the type of things that you consult about is how the testing will be carried out, how the staff will receive the test results, what will happen if they receive a positive test, and how, and to inform employees, of course, how the employer plans to use and store testing data in line with data protection law. And it recommends that any decision after discussion should be put in writing, i.e., again, we're looking at another policy, so a policy around testing in the workplace. If staff are concerned about testing, the ACAS guidance suggests it may help employers to consider paying them their usual rate of pay for time off after a positive test, or putting them on furlough. Now, I'm not quite sure about the putting on furlough, because given where furlough has continued to develop and evolve, it's unclear now really whether the furlough scheme can be used for that purpose. But nevertheless, I think ACAS are trying to again encourage staff to be tested and not fear and not hold back for fear of losing pay if a positive test comes back. So let's have a similar question, or the same question that we considered in terms of vaccination. Can an employer require employees to take a COVID-19 test? So first of all, first point, if you're going to do this, you need to apply it consistently to all your staff. Only testing certain groups who are perceived to be higher risk of contracting a virus could potentially lead to discrimination claims. So, for example, if you decided, actually, I'm only going to test my 18 to 30-year-olds in the workforce because they're the ones that are likely to go out and about more, and they probably and they wouldn't have had the vaccine yet. I'm only going to test them. Well, that's more likely to lead to discrimination issues on the basis of age, on the grounds of age. So if you're going to apply it consistently and don't make assumptions. And then moving on, we could think, okay, what about, so we're going to apply it consistently to our workforce, like we were considering with vaccinations. Direct discrimination risk, again, minimal for the same reason as the vaccinations, because you wouldn't be treating somebody less favourably because of a protected characteristic. So direct discrimination claims are likely to fail. However, indirect discrimination, again, it's all the same considerations that we've been through. I think it's probably a lower risk than with compulsory vaccinations, because I think it's less likely for particular groups of protected characteristics to be disadvantaged. Because obviously, you look at the vaccinations and you look at the age and the maternity and such forth, and you can see how it could potentially affect those groups. I think with the lateral flow testing, I think it would be harder to show that a group of people that share a protected characteristic would be disadvantaged. So I think the risk is lower, and also may well be potentially easier to show in terms of the defence of an indirect discrimination. It may be easier to show that you have a legitimate interest in that. It's a proportionate means of achieving that legitimate interest. In terms of unfair dismissal, so somebody refuses to take a lateral flow test. It could, if it's a contractual requirement, then it would be a breach of contract, or it could be still breach of contract in terms of failure to comply with an implied obligation to obey lawful and reasonable orders. So, a failure to follow a reasonable management instruction is what we say. So, employer could then potentially bring disciplinary proceedings. Potential reason for dismissal would be misconduct. But of course, again, with any dismissal, you also have to consider reasonableness. And whilst an employer may have understandable health and safety reasons for testing employees, employees may well regard this as an unnecessary invasion of their privacy. In addition, for those of you who have carried out COVID tests, you'll know that the process is uncomfortable, shall we say. And so employees may well feel it's unnecessarily invasive when they're not exhibiting any symptoms, and where there are other ways, for example, social distancing, to ensure that any symptomless infection isn't passed on to their colleagues. So again, we go back to the risk assessment. We consider whether testing is a proportionate way to address the health and safety risk, taking into account the risk assessment. Because this will go to your reasonableness and the fairness of any consequent action that you may take against an employee who refuses to test. Where a workplace is one in which it is difficult to maintain social distancing, then the employer may be in a stronger position. Practical guidance, I suppose, if an employee refuses to be tested, what should we do initially? Well, first and foremost, ask the employee why they don't want to get tested. And then seek to resolve their concerns. For example, is it about loss of pay if their test result becomes positive? And seek to address those concerns. And then perhaps even consider any options which means the employee wouldn't need to get tested. For example, if they're able to work from home. So I would always suggest that you go through those steps before taking any formal action. A really quick point on data protection, because I'm not a data protection specialist, and I pass it over to Matthew in our team. But remember that the ICO has confirmed that obtaining health information about an individual is special category data. And the ICO has advised that as long as there is a good reason for doing so, employers should be able to carry out health testing on employees, as data protection law doesn't prevent them from taking the necessary steps to keep their employees and the public safe during a pandemic. However, employers have to obviously handle employees' personal data with care. You're going to have to consider things like data protection impact assessment and making sure you don't collect unnecessary or excessive information. But I'm going to stop there because I'll reserve that for the specialists if there's any questions after the webinar. So I think that's where we are really in terms of testing. And I think for me, with the lateral flow tests, that one of the key points is to treat your employees consistently. We will come back to the questions, but I've just seen one about about the slides, and that's already been responded. Yes, we will circulate slides afterwards. Sorry, I've lost where the next slide is. There we go. General update. Well, as we all know, I can't do a webinar without mentioning the furlough scheme. So here we go. We know now that it's been extended to the 30th of September. We also know that for the last few months, it's going to be tapered. So this means that the employer must make a 10% contribution to the wages in July and a 20% contribution in August and September. From the employee's perspective, it remains the same because they will still receive 80% of their pay, subject to the £2,500 cap, monthly cap on wages. That was all I was going to say about furlough. You'll be ready to know. A move towards hybrid working. This is what is really coming out actually with quite a few of my clients at the moment. That and this is where I think the government think it's going to go as well. And it really is pointing towards that as the restrictions ease, lots of employers are considering a hybrid pattern of working, which involves both home and workplace working rather than a full return to the workplace. So if you're looking to formalise home working arrangements once the restrictions have eased, look at your contracts to see whether they have, appropriate clauses referring to home working. Take appropriate measures to ensure your confidential information and IT security is protected. And also review any health and safety implications of the arrangements, including risk assessments in terms of the home working setup. So that was just a point, really, just in terms of the direction of travel is towards hybrid working, and just a few little tidbits of things that you'll need to think about. Mental health, I think this has been interestingly already been covered by Lou in the aspect of the government kind of allowing a more of a return to the office for those that are struggling working from home all the time. And we are finding and discussions that I have with HR that many employees really are struggling with their mental health as a direct result of the pandemic, whether this is because of a bereavement of a close loved one from COVID, whether this is financial pressures if the partner's lost their job, or perhaps it's because they've been on a prolonged period of furlough and haven't been working, for I guess perhaps even up to a year now. And also the isolation. So when you start talking to your workforce about returning to work, whether that's returning to work from furlough or returning to the office, it's do take into account, mental health, potential fragility, and if you pick up anything, direct employees to any resources or any employment assistance programs that you may have in place. Or, of course, perhaps, refer them to, mental health charities such as Mind. So, again, just something just wanted to put on there and talk about very briefly, just something that we're seeing at the moment. And finally, I was just going to pick up really on face coverings, which I know we've already talked about, but the additional employment points to consider if an employee refuses to wear a face mask when instructed, because I have been asked that question a couple of times already. Yes, go back to the basics, I suppose. If an instruction to wear a mask is a reasonable management instruction in the circumstances, then yes, potentially disciplinary action here. But whether it's a reasonable management instruction will depend on many things. It will depend on the up-to-date official guidance. It depends on the up-to-date legislation around face masks. It depends on the reason for refusal, because of course, for some individuals wearing a face mask, there may be a medical reason why it's been advised that they shouldn't, or for some it causes heightened anxiety. And then really you need to look at the degree of risk, and this is where I go back to Lou, because you'll look at your risk assessment and you'll consider whether other measures are available to reduce the risk. For example, the 2 meters distancing, ventilation improvements, whether somebody could wear a visor instead of a mask. So you need to think of the alternatives. Yeah, I think that was all I was going to say on face masks, because I think, or face coverings, because I think that you've probably covered the other bits. Before we move on to questions, I just wanted to ask you to participate in a survey, which is in relation to COVID-19 tests, and whether you're planning on insisting employees take regular lateral flow tests if they're attending the workplace. I suppose what we could have done is ask the question before and afterwards, couldn't we? Before the webinar and after the webinar would have been quite interesting after you listened to us. But nevertheless, we're doing it now, and we thought it would just be interesting to see the responses and get a feel. So shall we tackle the questions?
I think we've kind of covered them between us, but we'll just go through them in any event. So the first one, can employers ask who's been vaccinated? From a health and safety perspective, it comes back down to that. Is it reasonable for you to ask that? Dependent upon your workplace, dependent upon the role. At this point, I would suggest not, simply because we're still in the rollout phases. But whether that's a question that you want to ask in the future, I think it is very much dependent upon your industry and your workforce. And there's not much more I think I can really say about that at the moment. I think if your work involves dealing with people who are at an increased risk, or there is an increased risk of you contracting the virus, then it might be something that you want to consider asking in the future. But I think we're just too early to say whether or not that is a reasonable request at this stage. I don't know whether there's anything else from your perspective, Vanessa, that you can add to that.
No, I agree entirely with that. I think it is a little bit early at the moment, just because of where we are with the rollout. I think, obviously, I've made the point in terms of recruitment. So that's kind of potential employees rather than actual employees. I think in terms of actual employees, you've got to think about the data protection implications in case of, what are you going to do with that data? How are you going to store it? And the compliance around there. In terms of, if you're asking who's been vaccinated and somebody refuses to give you a response, what are the potential follow-up action on that? Is it potential disciplinary? Then you've got to think about the reasonableness, and then you kind of go around kind of the issues that we've already talked about as to why are you asking. Is it reasonable for you to ask and expect a response?
No,
I think certainly if, say, for argument's sake, the direction of travel in a couple of months is very much the government says no, certain employees in certain sectors have to be must be vaccinated, and things become more compulsory, then I think our responses to some of these questions will be very different. But as the things stand, I would advise against it at the moment.
No, I agree. I agree with that. Janet's highlighted the Barchester on TV today, saying that they will not employ anyone without a very good excuse for not being vaccinated now. From the end of April, staff who do not have a good excuse will end up dismissed. All people going into their homes will need to be vaccinated first. And I've seen actually in Suffolk and Ipswich a couple of local care homes again making it mandatory. But on the other side, the flip to that side is that they may well have recruitment issues by taking that stance at this stage. Where there's a problem with recruitment in any event, that may just cause even more problems, in particular those younger people who were wanting to become carers who are now excluded from that. So I think to do that, okay, well that's within their gift to do that, but I would be wary about doing it, and I would be wary about perhaps claims being made to the civil courts, or even tribunal claims as a result of taking that stance at this stage. So I think good luck to them at this stage at the moment. And as I said, they may well find that they're struggling to get people to work for them if that is the stance that they're taking. Equally, I guess the other side to it is actually that might encourage more people to work there. I guess it works both ways. We've dealt with the slides question. And then we applied for free lateral flow tests under the company scheme 4 weeks ago, received the confirmation email that nothing. Are you aware of this with other clients? It's not obvious how you chase this up on the website. I must admit, I don't know the answer to that one. I've not heard of many people who have, or many employers who have taken up the lateral flow test, but so I don't know unless you have, Vanessa.
No, I haven't. I think I know a couple of employers who've looked into it, but have said that, because I think if you do follow that scheme, my understanding is that you have to have a designated person who is trained to administer and help with the tests. And I think they felt there was quite a few hurdles to jump through, and it wasn't necessarily as straightforward as it was advertised. But I haven't heard of any delays in receiving them. I'm quite surprised by that, I must say, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, we've had a question in via an email to lovely Amy, who's in the background but makes all this magic happen in terms of the webinar. So our executive team have decided that from the 1st of July, our sickness policy will resume in respect of when employees who are absent due to COVID. So any such absences will no longer be disregarded for the purpose of counting towards absence triggers and contractual sick pay. So obviously they've had triggers, but they've disregarded any absences due to COVID. I'd like to ask if this potentially raises any legal challenges, and in particular when staff are self-isolating, are awaiting a test. They're in the adult social care industry, and so obviously they have a lot of frontline care workers who've been able to work from home during any such period, and potentially could go on to nil pay depending on the number of occurrences. So there's two issues I think there. One is the contribution to the absence triggers, and the other is in terms of the contractual sick pay. I think with regards to the contribution to the sickness absence triggers, I can't think of any immediate discriminatory issues on this because you're applying it to all of the workforce. If you look at indirect discrimination, I don't see really how it would potentially affect one protected characteristic over another, because of course this is all due to being in contact with those that are in COVID, have COVID or suffering from COVID. But I think if you were to look at a scenario where an employee's absence triggers become high, and then you're looking at the capability process, and then you fast forward to perhaps the final meeting where you're looking to dismiss, I think my view is that there would be a risk of potential unfair dismissal, because I think if you're looking at the reasonableness of the decision to dismiss for the sickness absence, having taken into account the COVID absences and the time spent self-isolating when the government guidance is, well, it's not guidance, is it? It's mandatory. My view is that it would be quite hard to show that was a reasonable approach to take at the moment. In terms of the contractual sick pay, I think you'd really have to look at what the terms of the contractual sick pay say and whether they have any other exclusions. But to suddenly exclude it for absence due to COVID, I think you'd need a contractual change there. And again, if the sick pay is discretionary, you should be exercising your discretion reasonably. Have you got anything to add in terms of health and safety, Lou?
I don't think so, no. No, I'm just rereading the question.
Hopefully I've read it right.
Yeah, no, I think no, I don't think so. Not from a health and safety perspective.
No, it is true that a lot of employers have, said, right, we have absence triggers, but because with absence triggers, you discount potential disability related absence, of course, because otherwise you run the risk of disability discrimination claims. But I can't really think of a discrimination concern, but I can think that, with a consequent dismissal, I think that's quite risky. Well, I hope that answered that question. I don't think there are any more questions, and I think we've actually kind of pretty much finished at 12. The only other thing to say, sorry, is that I don't know whether you can see it on your screen, because I can see it on mine, but it's the results of the poll. So 18% are planning on insisting employees take regular lateral flow tests, and 80% aren't, which is probably what I thought, actually. Yeah. It's a cop out for me to say that now, isn't it? But it's probably in line, given some of the sectors that you work in. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us. Stay safe, stay well. If you've got any questions after the webinar, then do email. And please do leave some feedback once the webinar has ended. Thank you very much. Thanks.